Thank you. I am Patrick Rappold. When I was first invited to give this presentation, I was affiliated with the University of Arizona. Recently, I've become affiliated with Northern Arizona University. And so tonight's presentation will be on behalf of the University of Arizona and Northern Arizona University. So I'm going to start out by talking about the 2018 Aerial Forest Health Survey that was done in August. This is a forest health survey done by the USDA Forest Service annually. They typically start it in late July and it runs through August. They do aerial surveys across Arizona and New Mexico in a small airplane. And so essentially there's a couple of foresters in the airplane and they have these tablets and they're flying over these different mapped areas and they are drawing these polygons on their tablet to where they see dead and dying trees. So this is a photograph from Danny DePint. He's with the U.S. Forest Service Forest Health Monitoring Team. This is an area over by the Heber Overguard area. So each of these brown colored trees, it's a ponderosa pine tree that has either declined or is in the process of dying. Just another photograph kind of showing the scale of what we did see in 2018. Again, this is mostly these are mostly photographs from the Heber Overguard area and parts of the southern portion of Coconino County by the Happy Jack Blue Ridge area. So I'm going to take us back to the year 2000. These solid vertical bars, that is the acres of tree mortality in 2000 up to 2003. So we had a very high amount of tree mortality in 2003, and what this correlates to is the amount of precipitation. This blue line is the amount of precipitation, rainfall. This is the data from the Flagstaff Airport. This light gray line, this is the amount of snowpack or snowfall recorded at the Flagstaff Airport. So the reason we saw so much tree mortality in 2003 was lack of precipitation, lack of snowfall in the preceding years. So what did this look like on the ground? So this is the GIS data from the 2000 Aerial Forest Health Survey. These red dots, these red polygons, they represent areas that were either defoliated or impacted by different insects that killed the trees. This does not include wildfire damage. When they do these aerial surveys, they actually do not consider the wildfire damage to be part of the insect and disease damage. It's a different kind of survey. So let's look at how 2001 was, and so we can see the increased mortality. This is Prescott, this is Flagstaff up here, and then 2003. So this was the year when we saw the most tree mortality following the preceding drought periods. And so heavily impacted right here, and as I'm sure many people in this room remember, heavily impacted the Pinyon Pine areas in Yavapai County. This is 2003. So let's just go back a little bit. So I just present this because I'm going to go into the 2016 to 2018 data, and we try to predict what's going to happen in the future based upon these past events, based upon precipitation, snowfall. So this is the most current data. This is 2018. We haven't seen the extent of mortality as 2003, but as homeowners, every tree is precious. I spent most of my time last summer just working with homeowners on individual bases, diagnosing what impacted their trees and how to better prepare for next year. So again, precipitation, snowfall, it plays a big role in tree mortality and tree health. So let's start with 2016. We have some issues up here just south of Flagstaff. I believe this was mostly a defoliator. If you follow that Oak Creek Canyon down to Sedona, you'll see some of those cottonwoods, some of the hardwood trees. So I think this was mostly, as I remember, this was due to defoliators. 2017, this was done in July, August 2017, so we're still seeing some of the issues around Sedona. A little bit of hot spots over here. So this is 2018. And so here is Payson, so this is the Mogollon Rim here, and so the Forest Service did record a lot of tree mortality along those areas. This is mostly ponderosa pine, and so since this flight has been surveyed, we have received some local reports of additional small patches of pinyon pine mortality, sort of in this area here. I haven't seen it myself. I don't know the extent of it. It may require that the Forest Service does another follow-up flight just to continue to assess this data. But they typically only fly during July and August just for certain budget reasons and also just weather patterns. So why did we see this pattern of drought in 2018? It has a lot to do with this severe drought index here. So if you look at this area here, this is the Heber Overguard area. This is where I spent most of my time dealing with the tree mortality. And this area here is where the Blue Ridge Happy Jack community is. We also saw decent amounts of tree mortality up there last summer. So what did we see on the ground? So this is a ponderosa pine tree fading, turning with the needles to a brown color. And so with this tree here, we peeled off the bark and we did find bark beetles inside. So this is what we typically found in most of our trees that were dying or declining. And so this is a photograph from the lakeside area, Pine Top, and so this is behind a nice home, and this homeowner here, she's very distressed about this, and so we talked about thinning the lots. If you reduce the number of trees you have on your lot, then the remaining trees have more water and nutrients to better protect themselves from insects and disease. So the way we identify for bark beetles is we find a dead tree, we will take a hatchet and peel off the bark. And so these are very distinctive gallery patterns. And so the entomologists I work with, they can actually identify the species of the bark beetle just based upon the pattern. So each bark beetle kind of has its own little pattern. I forget which pattern this is. This might be the Ips beetle. And so I'll just pass around this piece of bark and you can kind of see the pattern for yourself and how it makes its impact on the tree. Now, I'll also pass around some of these bark beetle samples that came from Heber, and so they're very, very tiny. They're up in the kind of the corners of these blocks, and so I'll take some of these and pass them around. Yep. And so the bark beetles and a lot of the insects and disease we have in Arizona, they're always with us, but they tend to have a bigger impact during drought when the trees are stressed. And so the reason that the bark beetles attack the stressed out trees is the trees give off a chemical signal that it is weakened. So this does attract bark beetles. And so if you have a large mass of dying and dead trees, you do tend to attract more bark beetles. So that's why we try to practice, or we try to encourage homeowners to thin out their lots. We're working with the Forest Service to do some landscape scale thinning, some, you know, hundreds of thousands of acres trees being thinned out for forest health purposes. Interestingly enough, we did find some dead juniper last summer, and so as many of you know, it's very tough to kill a juniper, and so we're closely monitoring this. As we all know, if you travel north on 89 as a whole, it's very dense juniper forest, very dense juniper woodland, so we need to monitor that, because a lot of times these dead trees, whether they be ponderosa pines or junipers, they can be catalysts for wildfires. And so if you have a density as high as up by Drake and Paulden of this juniper, it can create a very high fuel hazard. So what projects are being implemented across the state, across the rim country? So this orange area here, this is the South Kaibab Grassland Restoration Project. This is around, I believe, 300,000 acres of grassland restoration. So this involves reducing the number of junipers on across the land. It helps to bring back the native grasses. It helps to, and then the grasses better retain the soil, better retain the water. So that's being done in northern Yavapai County and also portions of southern Coconino County. The Chino Restoration Project is planned to be implemented on the Prescott National Forest. So this is a combination of grassland restoration, it's a combination of hazardous fuels reduction, and it's also has some forest restoration activities planned in there around the Bradshaw Mountains. This is the large forest restoration initiative, better known as FORFRI. So this encompasses around 400,000 acres based around the Flagstaff area, extending to Williams and down to just above Gila County. I'm sure you've all heard of this project, good and bad. And then this is the second phase of the Forest Restoration Initiative. This is the Rim Country Project. So this extends from southern Coconino County all the way into Navajo County and possibly portions of Apache County. And so again, this is entirely forest restoration. This is mechanical thinning followed by prescribed fire. So what does forest restoration look like? The way foresters measure the stand densities, it's a measurement called basal area. So this is a stand that has 150 square feet of basal area per acre. So essentially, the higher the basal area, the more wood fiber or trees. It's kind of an analogous term, but this is 150 square feet. This is 30 square feet. So when you open up the stands, you do get the grasses coming back, and you break up the pattern of the crown, and so that helps to diminish any crown fires that may occur. It's also focused to reduce any ladder fuels that may spread fire from the ground up into the crown of the trees. So this is an area that was photographed in 2008. It was marked for treatments, and this is the follow-up in 2010. So keep your eye on this tree here. This is your marker tree, and so this is what I believe this was done near Munns Park, if I recall correctly. So just another photograph. This is also taken in 2008. So again, this is your reference tree. And so once they released the trees, we saw the Gamble oak come back. So oak is very good for wildlife. It supports the wildlife, and it prevents any issues. It definitely breaks up the crown, and so it's definitely reducing the hazardous fuels across this landscape. And I'm sure if you've been to the Bradshaw Mountains, you've seen similar treatments like this. So what does it look like from above? So this is the Fort Tuthill area, just south of Flagstaff. This area here is where they have that extreme zip line course. And so this area here and this area here was treated around 14 months ago or so. So this is before, this is after. So they really couldn't treat around that zip line area, so that density kind of remained the same, but this is the typical spatial pattern you see after a forest restoration project. It's commonly referred to as clumpy groupy. It kind of clumps the old trees together, then it has an empty space, and then it clumps some more trees together. So that's kind of the general pattern that, you know, best describes this kind of silvicultural practice application. So how is forest restoration done? It's typically done with mechanical logging equipment. So this is a feller buncher. So the way this machine works is it takes this front end of the machine and it grabs the tree, and then it has a saw at the bottom and it will separate that tree from the stump. And so the important part is to remember you now have a 60-foot tree in your machine, and so you have to keep that gravity, that center of gravity just right. Otherwise this happens. And so they are designed to have, you know, safety features. They are designed to roll over, just not every day. The operators do have seat belts and everything. So it's not a fun day, but, you know, these machines are designed to do that. And if you look at that ground is very flat. So obviously what might have probably happened there is that center of gravity with those trees, and sometimes they can carry multiple trees, it just became off center and it took that machine over. So then after the trees are cut, this machine is a log skidder. This machine drags the trees to the landings, where then a merchandiser will cut the logs into various lengths depending on which sawmill it's going to. And so if you notice, none of these machines, or all of these machines, have one operator in a cab surrounded by steel. And so these logging companies, if they get their operators off the ground and they take the chainsaws out of their hands, it's much less insurance cost. That operator is now in a cab. Trees can fall on that piece of equipment. As we saw, that piece of equipment can fall over. It just reduces the hazard to the operators, and it just makes logging more safer. So what do we do with the trees? So if I have a large tree, and I don't, because most of what we're removing is the smaller diameter trees, everything typically 16 inches and under and less. So if I have a large tree, I can yield all this product. But because we're only cutting small diameter trees, typically all we get is this centerpiece. So what do we make out of that centerpiece? We make a lot of pallet cans. And so next time you're in Walmart or a Safeway, check out the pallets. Sometimes you can tell where they come from. My wife gets a little frustrated with me when I'm shopping with her, and I'm always looking at the pallets, but that's just, you know, that's just my thing. And so a lot of the logs cut in Flagstaff and Williams, and some of the logs cut here on the Prescott National Forest, they're shipped down to different companies in Phoenix, and they actually will saw the log up and they'll make these pallets. And so because a lot of the pallets are used for agricultural use, they do cross over international borders, especially with Mexico. A lot of the pallets end up in Nogales or south of Tucson. They get incorporated into the agricultural markets. They have to have this heat treatment stamp. So that means this piece of wood was in a dry kiln for 8 hours at 160 degrees at least. That implies that all the insects in that piece of wood are now dead. So in the past, the United States has imported a number of very catastrophic insects that have come in wooden pallets and have since decimated many of our ash trees and elm trees. So this is why most countries now require this heat treatment to occur before any wood products across the borders, across international borders. This is a dry kiln. This is where the lumber gets heat treated. These are industrial dry kilns. Before coming to Arizona, I operated 25 of these in southwest Pennsylvania. It's you're always warm, okay? It doesn't matter what time of the year it is. You're always warm when you're working in the dry kiln. They start at temperatures around 80 degrees and go up to 170, so it doesn't matter if it's July or March. You're going to have an opportunity to stay warm if you're a dry kiln operator. So this is a dry kiln from Oregon. This is a high temperature dry kiln. It's on tracks. The wood actually travels through the dry kiln. At the center of the dry kiln is the highest temperature. That's around, I believe it's 250 degrees for this type of kiln. We don't dry lumber like this in Arizona. In the state of Arizona, we typically dry our ponderosa pine a little bit slower, and we typically don't exceed the temperature of 170 degrees. But this is typically how they saw the 2x4s and the studs in the Pacific Northwest. And so all this steam and clouds here, that's just the evaporation of the water and just the hot air from the dry kiln interfacing with the cold air outside. And so this happens 24 hours a day with dry kilns. When I was a dry kiln operator, I used to get calls all the time, midnight, Christmas Eve, because these things do break down, so you have to go there. You have to fix them, because if you leave the wood in there, it can degrade the wood. So this is just a photograph out of Arizona, and it shows all the different pallets they're shipping the watermelons on. And so, you know, it's like seeing clouds. Once you start seeing them, you don't stop seeing them. So next time you're out, just look for your pallets. Pallets were invented by the U.S. military just during World War II to help to efficiently move products, and so we've always had pallets around. Most of the pallets are made from low-grade lumber, and so it's just a good use for that small diameter material we're trying to take off the forest to improve forest health and also reduce the risk of catastrophic fire. So why not plastic? Because. So the reason you don't see as much plastic, or the reason plastic isn't as good, is because when this breaks, the whole pallet is essentially done. But with a wooden pallet, there are companies in Phoenix and across the United States that will take the broken wooden pallets, they'll break them down, and they'll actually resell them. And so whenever you see the pallets stacked up outside Home Depot or Safeway or Lowe's, there's probably somebody out there buying those pallets or just picking them up, recycling them, and selling them again to different operations. So that's what's great about wood. It's renewable, it's recyclable, and it can be, you know, it's a renewable resource. How do we make the lumber for the pallets? We have several different sawmills in Arizona. This is a high-speed sawmill in Snowflake, Arizona. This sawmill is specifically designed to process small diameter logs. It can process around 5 logs. Let's see, what is the figure I'm looking for? It probably process around 5 logs per minute, which is pretty good for a high-speed mill. This mill is also portable. It can be transported on 3 semi-trucks. And so the concept there is, if we have a large forest restoration project on the east side, this company could relocate to the west side of the state and utilize that material. It gives them great flexibility in terms of financing this machine and also just, you know, financing their business. Most of what the machine makes is just these squares. So these are what we call pallet cants. So these are sold to pallet manufacturers who then take the pallet cant and they will resaw it into the 1-inch boards, and then they will make the pallets through different nailing operations. So the way this particular machine works is it just pushes a log through. It has a number of different cutting heads on it. It's very efficient in terms of processing. It does make a lot of sawdust. And so because we're processing small diameter logs, you typically only get 1 or 2 boards or 1 pallet cant per log. But this is the one of the higher value products. This can be made into the wood heating pellets that we see at Lowe's. There is a wood heating pellet manufacturer in Sholo, so they will buy this nice clean, these nice clean wood chips, and they will make that wood heating pellets. So this is a photograph from the Prescott National Forest. So a lot of what's going on up here is hazardous fuels reduction. This is a masticator. So this is the before, and this is the after. So you can see the foresters, they broke up those lighter fuels. They decreased the amount of ground fuels, and they also opened it up for the native grasses to grow. It's just a different view of a masticator. There's around 7 or 8 of these machines in Arizona. I think most of them are centered right here in Yavapai County because there is so many ranchers and communities that want this work done, and so that's why I tend to see most of these machines in this area of the state. These machines also do a lot of right-of-way clearing for APS and also ADOT. So essentially it just it eats anything in front of it. It can take down a telephone pole if you're not careful enough. That's just, you know, it's all hydraulic power. You're pumping around 640 gallons per minute through those hydraulic lines, so it's just it's a large mowing machine. This is a video from a masticator working in Texas. This is all mesquite, which we do have an abundance of it in Yavapai County. So it just goes through, it mows everything over. Very efficient. I'm sure it'd be fun for about 2 days, and it's just like, you know, mowing your lawn. It gets kind of boring, but it is being done, especially in Yavapai County. So this is some photographs from just north of Paulden. So this is the treatment before. This is the after the treatment, and so not all the juniper was taken off. When they do these grassland restoration treatments, they do retain a lot of the juniper around the streams and wetlands and riparian areas, and so typically it's not 100% removed. They do create these mosaic patterns just for to break up the fuel patterns and also just to increase the health of the grasses and also the health of the junipers. This is typically what you see after a masticator goes through, so it's a lot of stringy material, needles and everything. So one of the reasons we can't do more mastication, one of the reasons we can't do more grassland restoration is because we don't have a market for this. We have a market for ponderosa pine pellet cans, but it's very tough to find a market for this. And so what I've done with some other groups is we've explored some different products. These are sediment wattles. So these are the wattles that they put up for soil erosion, water retention. So these are made with juniper chips. So this is the application. You put your wattle sock on this chute here. There's a hydraulic auger inside here. It essentially just feeds that like a sausage maker almost. So this is one of the applications we're exploring. Another application is biochar. And so I do have some a biochar sample up here. This was made by a company in Missouri. If you do open it, make sure you don't spill on yourself. It does stain, and it has a very, to me it reminds me of steak cooking, so it has a very pungent odor. That's why I'll pass that around. And so biochar is essentially a high-tech form of charcoal. It's made using very low temperatures, cooking the wood over extended periods of time, and you can make different forms of it. This is the granular biochar, similar to what I'm passing around here. This is the pelletized biochar combined with some peat moss, and so the big market for this is the gardeners. So if anybody is a master gardener, this is what the high-end fertilizer is. Some people call this the fertilizer of the future. It is, however, not cheap. So this is $47 for one bag. Luckily, my wife is not a gardener, so I'm not forced to buy this yet, but it would support some grassland restoration if we did buy it. So this is a company out of Oregon. They sell mass quantities, so I think 1 cubic yard is $250. Oh, this is a 2 cubic yard super sack right here, so this is actually $500. And so, who would pay this much for it? One of the marketing strategies I've seen is the marijuana growers. So if you're a marijuana grower, I'm assuming your profit's pretty high, and you can afford this product. And so that's because this company's in Oregon, that's why they're based in Oregon, because it is recreational use up there. This is a loose truckload, 115 cubic yards for, I think that's $15,000. So you can have a sports car, or you can have a truckload of biochar. But again, this is, it seems to be working up in Oregon. They have different markets for it. They also have a lot more of sawmills. They also have a different kind of juniper. They have the western, I think it's kind of like the western juniper, so it's a little bit bigger, and it yields a little bit more sawdust to make this product. So this is a flatbed trailer, also around $15,000 just for the super sacks. And the biggest market probably in Arizona is the agricultural producers down south. And so the biochar can be applied in high volumes using different equipment. So that's my talk tonight. In terms of urban forest health in Yavapai County, we are seeing issues with blue spruce. And so during periods of the winter drought, we do recommend that you water your blue spruce. Blue spruce planted at this elevation, it's not quite the ideal habitat elevation for blue spruce. And so because of that, we do recommend some watering during dry periods of the winter. Last summer, I did receive a couple of phone calls from Yavapai County about some blue spruce issues. I did see some pitch pine and some of the pinyon pines last summer. The pitch pine, or the pitch moth, looks very bad. You'll have pitch coming out of your trees, but typically the pitch moth, it's not fatal. And so the bark beetle issue, it's a much bigger issue, but they actually produce much less sap output than the pitch moth does. And so I'm open to some questions about urban tree health. My expertise is more in the landscape forestry, but I do work closely with Jeff Shalau here at the Yavapai County Extension Office, and so he couldn't be here tonight. He had a master gardener meeting in Mojave County, and so I was going to use him as a backup to answer all my urban forestry questions, or urban tree questions, but I can probably field some questions if you have any, or anything about landscape scale forest restoration. Question in the back?
What's the nutrient value of the biochar?
The question is, what is the nutrient value of the biochar? I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, but essentially what it is trying to replicate is the Amazon rainforest soil. We have all that dead and decomposing material. I think it's called Terra Petra is the soil type down there in the Amazon. And so its marketing mechanism, its perceived benefit to the soil is increased organic matter, and it helps retain water. Because of that water retention properties, there are golf courses in Arizona and Phoenix looking at using biochar. But the concept being if you use biochar, the grass will retain more of the water, so you have to water less. So that's one of the potential applications of biochar. One of the reasons biochar is so expensive is because there's not really a high value method of making it yet. And so I think the most high volume company that can make biochar is up in Canada. I think they can do around 15 million tons a year, which in terms of soil amendments is not that great. So that's that cost mechanism where if we can find a tool or a process to make biochar faster and at larger quantities, we may see the cost come down. So I'll take the one in the back first.
Biochar is applied, so a cubic foot or cubic yard
not the depth of biochar. So what is the depth that
Okay.
you would use?
Typically, the application is to till it into the soil. I don't know the application rates. There's actually different, I would say, flavors of biochar. So you can make biochar out of different woody products. You can make biochar out of pistachio shells. And so the key is to work with your manufacturer, whoever you buy it off of, and see what those feed rate recommendations are. I'm not sure about that either. I would just base it upon the manufacturer recommendations. It's just one of those things where I try to deal more with the biochar aspect in terms of finding companies that want to come to Arizona to make this product so we can do more grassland restoration projects. That might be a good question for Jeff Shalal. He may have that answer. In the front? Sure. The question is has there been studies done on the effects of forest restoration on the wildlife and especially the birds? And so when the USDA Forest Service does a project, there's at least 12 months of pre-work done involving an environmental impact statement. And so that environmental impact statement takes into account any effect those treatments would have on wildlife, recreation, and especially birds. So in Arizona, we have the goshawk, which is I believe a threatened and endangered species, and we also have the Mexican spotted owl, which is, I believe, still listed as threatened and endangered. And so those two bird species, those are very much considered during forest restoration projects. And so the whole concept of the clumpy groupy silvicultural application, it's actually to provide some, I guess I'll call it protection areas for the goshawk so they can actually fly around and not be attacked by predators. That's just my understanding of the wildlife aspects of that forest restoration activities. Did I answer it good enough? Did you have any? Sure. I mean, you're right now, as more forest restoration is occurring in Arizona, there are different groups doing studies. The Ecological Restoration Institute has numerous studies ongoing. So does the Arizona Game and Fish Department, just because monitoring is a big part of the forest restoration process. So we want to monitor the effects of it as we're going. And so every summer, a number of college students go out in groups and they actually go to these plots and they actually monitor wildlife. They monitor the grasses that come back. And so there's continuous monitoring going on. I just don't believe it's been written up yet. But you know, we can cite studies from different parts of the country, like such as Oregon and Washington State, that have done similar forest restoration projects. I think you were next.
So we just fire lines out property. One of the things we noticed is a far less concentration of wildlife on the property, especially birds. So the question for you is, when you do this restoration, does that decrease dramatically the wildlife?
Typically, no. I mean, during the actual harvesting of it, the birds and the animals don't stick around when that feathered buncher is operating, even though they are very quiet machines. But typically, what some of the initial studies have seen is we have seen more corridors for the elk and the antelope being made and stuff like that. So it just enables them to travel more. But you know, I am not a wildlife expert, but so far we're into the Forest Restoration Initiative was started in 2000, or the first contract was implemented in 2012, and so there's been monitoring going on since 2012, along with other projects. And so if there was any red flags, I'm sure the Forest Service would be addressing it. There has been some red flags raised about certain projects that cut trees a little bit larger than they should be cut. So that means it's the only issue I've come across so far is just the issues with cutting some of the larger trees for overall forest health, and that it's an ongoing debate about which trees should be cut depending on which disease is affecting that tree, so. In the back?
So biochar, question, comment, seems like a very, very pricey fertilizer, and fertilizer, you worry about nitrogen and potassium and phosphorus. There may be something with the soil tilth if you've got a very clayey soil. I'm trying to imagine what about that makes it so worthy as a quote fertilizer.
Yeah, I do have some chemical analysis on my laptop in my office, but
But that's expensive nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, big time. I mean, you're not gonna put that in soybeans and corn in Iowa, for example.
Right.
No way.
and it's just a matter of, in my opinion, that the application to make the biochar isn't at scale yet. So, if it's just like anything, cars are expensive because a lot of engineering and work goes into those cars, and just like anything else, when the first flat screen plasma TVs came out, they were very expensive because there was limited quantities. But as the different companies that started making them, the price went down. So I suspect biochar is going to be a similar market. The issue is that the biochar market is competing against the wood heating pellet market for that wood waste, and so there's different competitors, different competition for that wood waste from the sawmills to make that product. So it's just those market dynamics of forest products. So. You can go first.
Okay, doesn't removing all the biochar precursor impoverish the soils from where it's taken?
So I think what the question is if you take the vegetation off the landscape, is that affecting the soil?
Well, yeah, normally it would decompose there and enrich the soil.
Well, I come from the Northeast, where if you leave a log in the forest for 12 months, it decomposes, and we just don't see that same mechanisms in the Southwest, where we have wood decompose on the ground. That's why we have the Petrified National Forest, right? Or Petrified National Park, because wood does not decompose easily in Arizona, and so that's why when we do logging operations, we don't leave the slash in the forest. We either burn it or we take it off-site and we chip it up. So typically, what you would expect to see in the Northeast, the Pacific Northwest, where those trees are decomposing and providing nutrients back to the soil, we don't see that as much in Arizona just because we don't have the biological mechanisms to make that decomposition happen. Yeah? Question?
Yeah, two non-pertinent questions. First one is, your opinion, forest density. Not a problem in Arizona, medium problem, or drastic problem in Arizona? And then the second question is, to flag that area, species that are increasing and species that are decreasing, what do you see?
Sure. In terms of the first part of the question, is there a issue with forest density in Arizona? Yes, there is. That's why there's been so many collaborative groups that have come together. We've had environmental groups, conservation groups, state agencies, and federal agencies come to the table and actually come to an agreement on what type of forest restoration implementation should occur. And so if you travel down by Payson and areas like that, there is an overabundance of trees in certain areas. And so for the first part of your question, I would definitely say that yes, there is an overabundance of trees in Arizona across rim country, and that also applies down to Tucson for, in Safford on Mount Graham. Your second part of the question, which trees am I seeing more regenerate in the Flagstaff area? So at the typical ponderosa pine elevation, we are seeing a lot more ponderosa pine regeneration occurring as we open up the stands. We also see a lot more of the oak regenerate as we have the sunlight hit the soil. There is some issues with the spruce as you travel to the higher elevations. There is, I believe it's a spruce aphid that's having a big impact on some of the spruce at 9,000 and 10,000 feet. And we're seeing that at the San Francisco peaks. And I believe it's also impacting Mount Baldy over on the White Mountain Apache lands. And so in terms of regeneration, it's a lot of ponderosa pine, and hopefully there's some solutions for that spruce aphid also. yes, there is a lot of birds up there to taking care of that problem. Unfortunately, it takes a lot to attract them there, so you need that mass quantity of aphids in order for the birds to come and be there. Did I answer your question? Good? Okay.
So, isn't some of the reason for the thinning because you suppress fire and sort of to the point of decomposing and logs on the ground, if the fire had been allowed to do what it normally did, you wouldn't have the density, you wouldn't be doing the thinning and the restoration in that respect. When you say restoration, you just don't mean planting trees, you mean changing the landscape to look more what it was with that fire.
Yes, the term forest restoration refers to mimicking stand conditions before we actively did fire suppression. So the Forest Service used to have a policy where the wildfires had to be out by 10 a.m. the next day. So there was massive efforts to put out wildfires. And so we essentially, we were very good at suppression, and as a result, you know, the trees were not, the smaller, weakened, unhealthy trees were not taken out by the fires. And so that is one of the measurements we're trying to look at is, you know, the effects of restoration on catastrophic wildfire. And so, unfortunately, we did see some of those positive effects after the wildfire, where the treatments from the White Mountain Stewardship Project surrounding towns such as Eager and Greer and Nutrioso, that fire did kind of lay down as it hit those treatments where there was less tree density. And there's numerous case studies about that fire and how those treatments beforehand actually helped firefighters go in there and protect the structures. So for the White Mountain Stewardship Project, the first primary areas to be treated were around the wildland urban interface, you know, in Greer and those areas there. So you are correct. So in the front.
When they decide on thinning techniques and how much is climate change considered in that, because we've got to take the forest back to where it was 200 years ago. By the time it grows up, the climate may be very different than it was 200 years ago.
Yes, so the Forest Service does account for climate change in its environmental impact statements, and the overall goal is to create resilient forests. And so, based upon science that different foresters and universities have done, we have determined that the treatments being implemented for different areas, and each treatment's a little bit differently, you know, it's not a uniform treatment, that it does create a more resilient forest. And you know, this whole process, it's not a one-step process. There will be follow-up treatments as the trees get bigger and as we see different insects and diseases come into these stands. We have this very vibrant, expanding forest products industry. So if we stop doing treatments, we would essentially lose that industry, but the trees would keep growing. So we would be in a similar situation 50 years from now that we're in now, where we have an overdensity of small diameter trees. Right behind you.
I have two questions.
Okay.
One is, well, first of all, I'm new to the area, so when I do a lot of hiking and I see the, you know, the large trees being taken down, and then I see these huge piles of leftover branches, logs, whatever, do they generally stay in the forest, and if they do, like for how long? Or you see them and everybody's gone, and it's, you know, it looks like it's been a long time since, you know, they've been there. And then my other question is about the difference between clearing the forest, as people are clearing the forest, versus the buyer clearing the forest and the benefits of, you know, because there are a lot of benefits from the actual buyer clearing it versus people doing it. So I don't know what.
Sure. Yeah. So your first question is about the brush piles. And so after the logging or after even hand thinning operations, there are some brush piles out there. And so the typical plan of attack is to, one, either remove the brush piles. There is a biomass power plant in Snowflake. They will buy those chips from those brush piles. But if the economics don't work out, then the Forest Service typically goes in and they burn the brush piles. And so the ideal time to burn a brush pile, it's during a snowstorm, because your chance of that fire spreading, because if you have a 15-foot tall brush pile, it can put up some flames, and so it's always best to have a lot of snow or moisture to suppress that fire and just control that fire. And so in 2017, 2018, we didn't have a lot of snow impact in Arizona, so there is 2 or 3 year old brush piles out there right now. It's just a matter of timing the brush pile burning around the weather, because you really can't do it in the spring when it gets too dry and stuff like that, 'cause it's just too dangerous. So the second part of your question is, yes, we can thin out the forest different ways, but by putting fire back across that landscape, it does clean up the needles, and it does put nutrients back in that soil. So we would much rather see prescribed fire after the logging treatments than, say, new homes coming in. So, yeah, I think you were next.
I'm very ignorant in this area, so I'll preface my statement or my question by that. What I don't understand is, and I understand that the burning that we're trying to suppress forest fires is the worst thing that we should have done. How do we know that how we're handling it now is in fact the correct way, and who is doing these studies? And where are they funded by the state that this is the good way to do it? That's my question.
Sure. One of the easiest ways we determine how the stand structure was, say, in the 1800s, was we go out in the forest and we can actually find tree stumps that are 3 or 4 foot high. And so what that tells us is that tree was cut with a crosscut saw. Because if you're a logger with a chainsaw, you're going to get down and you're going to take that entire tree out, because a lot of that valuable wood is at the base. But if you're in the 1800s and you're just cutting trees to clear land or make railroad ties for the railroad to come in, you have a crosscut saw, so you're up here. And so next time you're in a forest, let's look around and you will see some of these 4 foot tall stumps. And so I believe what that's called is a historical reference. And so we can go out there and we can actually see how many tree stumps are in an acre. And that's one of the methods that have been used to determine what the stand density was, say, back in the 1850s and earlier. So the research, a lot of the research in Arizona, it's being done by the Ecological Restoration Institute on the Northern Arizona University campus. And so there's a professor up there, his name is Wally Covington. And so he's sort of the father of forest restoration. He had this concept that if we reduce the stand densities to these pre-settlement conditions, then we would have less catastrophic wildfires. And so that was his theory, and so he went about and he developed the Ecological Restoration Institute. So that whole institute is focused primarily on studying forest restoration, different treatments. And so that's it's probably the leading group that I know on doing forest restoration. And so they're funded by different grants. They have, I think, a staff of 25 people now, and so they're all bringing in grant funding projects to just study forest restoration, whether it be wildlife or animals or forest products now also. Did I answer your question, or?
Mostly except I still don't know who the grant forest are.
Oh, okay, so.
I was curious because I still don't know the answer to how do we know that this is the best way, or we might not yet know. It might be a question.
Sure. I mean, the people allocating the grants, it's typically the USDA. There's also some different nonprofits, such as the Nature Conservancy. They contribute money to study forest restoration. And I've talked to various third-generation loggers in Arizona, and they say we're kind of making an even-age stand, and so they kind of worry about one disease coming in and taking out that even-age stand. And so, it's sort of a work in progress, but what the primary purpose is reduce that immediate fire threat. because we have such a growing state and everybody wants to live in beautiful Prescott or Payson. So if we can first reduce that threat of wildfire, then we can go in, do some monitoring, do some follow-up treatments, and actually kind of figure out, what is the best method. So, yep.
We appreciate all the questions. If you'd like to talk to Patrick afterwards, if you have more questions, we welcome you to do that. I'm sure Patrick will be willing to stick around for a few minutes afterwards. We would like to thank Patrick on behalf of Prescott Audubon, and we have a certificate for you to thank you for your time here tonight. And we also want to give you a lens cleaning kit.
Oh, thank you.
That has the Prescott Audubon logo on it.
Thank you.
Thank you.